books and digging through old newspapers to put together a picture of this movement. There's a couple of good books out there. Radical Spirits by Anne Broad is one that I lean on heavily in this presentation, and there's a few others. So let me preface things by saying that I'm not a spiritualist, I'm not a believer, but I'm not necessarily an unbeliever either, just haven't had any weird things happen to me. My focus is on the history of this underreported social phenomenon, not judgment. It's not an expose, and it's not a puff piece, just an examination of the spiritualists from Sacramento's perspective. They were progressives and deeply entwined with 19th century reform movements, including rights for African Americans and Native Americans, and are especially associated with the early women's movement, although they would later be pushed out of leadership roles as the movement became more mainstream. Fundamental to understanding the appeal of spiritualism is to look at the world in which it emerged. As the population became increasingly urban, the lack of sanitation and poor medical care led to horrific mortality rates and outbreaks like Sacramento's own devastating cholera epidemic of 1850. Rapid social change and the alienation and confusion it generated didn't seem to be addressed by old-time religion, and the traditional Christian explanation for mass loss and suffering seemed inadequate to many. To quote author Joseph Good, fundamentally, spiritualism was a Victorian attempt to address the existential dilemma of continuing to live in a world where joy is fleeting and the journey of life has but one single inexorable terminus. 1848 was a momentous year with repercussions that would be felt for decades. Not only was it the year gold was discovered on the Sacramento River, but the year revolutions happened in France, Germany, Hungary, and even Brazil, and led to much emigration to the far west. Marx and Engels published their Communist Manifesto. Reform movements flourished in the United States, particularly New York State, where the first convention for women's rights was held. In upstate New York lived the Fox family. In 1848, the two younger sisters, Kate and Margaret, aged 11 and 14, were sleeping in the family farmhouse and heard mysterious noises, knocks, raps, and bumps in the night. They soon concluded that these noises were an unearthly communication from the beyond, coming from the spirit of a peddler who had been murdered in the house. They learned they could communicate with him and other spirits by a series of knocks and raps. There soon was an explosion of contact with the afterlife all over the country, making spiritualism the first spiritual movement that America exported abroad. The difficulty of knocking out long codes was fixed with the addition of slate writing and trance speaking, and a few years later, physical manifestations. A slate is a small handheld chalkboard, for those unaware. In addition, before the emergence of the Fox sisters, the American public had grown accustomed to many phenomena later associated with spiritualism through well-publicized displays of animal magnetism and mesmerism. Many were familiar with the works of popular mystics like Swedenborg, Andrew Jackson Davis, not to mention transcendentalists like Walt Whitman. I found a spiritualist hymnal at the State Library, and this is a typical song called God in Nature. And each breeze that wanders free, and each flower that gems the sod, living souls may hear and see freshly uttered words from God. God is present and doth shine through each scene beneath the sky, kindling with the light divine every form that meets the eye. Let us then with searching mind seek a good where'er it springs. We shall then true wisdom find, hidden in familiar things. And that's an example of their belief in the God in nature. Very much a product of the modern age, spiritualism became a movement by disassociating itself from any occult tradition and appealing not to the inward illumination of mystic experience, but to the observable and verifiable objects of empirical science. That stance proved the right formula to capture the attention of the age, which believed that the universe operated as an orderly machine. Seances were called tests, and attendees were investigators. The Telegraph was a popular illustration of their contentions, a reduction of something once considered marvelous to a completely understandable occurrence, and furnished an analogy as how spiritual communication might be achieved. There is also a newspaper pictured here called the Spiritual Telegraph from 1852 to 1860. Spiritualists did not view themselves as eccentrics or occultists. They intended no attack on the mechanical order of the universe which science had constructed, indeed urged science to recognize an extension of mechanical laws into unseeable worlds. The claims of spiritualism became believable in the same way electrical phenomena had become believable. While never quite achieving respectability, the spiritualists clearly attracted everyone's attention and had an impact upon respectable people. Important men of business, politics, the arts, and journalism discussed the implications of their claims with dead earnestness. Oh, I guess that slide didn't want to work. There's a book called Our Sunday Talks, which I found at the State Library, and a few quotes from that one. To the materialist, the physical world is the all in all of the universe. But science is constantly unfolding new and imponderable forms of which the senses take no note. It is not our purpose to clear up the mist that hover over the borderland of the physical, that the things which seem to be to us to be the most tangible and real are in fact the most evanescent and unreal, while the unchanging and everlasting belong exclusively to the domain of the imponderable, or as we prefer them, the spiritual. So let's meet some of our Sacramento spiritualists. There's a ghost photo. Here we go. This is Walton C. FELCH, and he was a Massachusetts native. His father was a prominent physician. His uncle was an Episcopalian clergyman. He was a printer when he heard about the gold in California and took the overland route with the company in spring 1849. He mined on the American River, then came to Sacramento and established himself as a sign painter. His shop being on 5th between J and K, and he painted oil portraits for fun. He's pictured here wearing a Oddfellows apron. And here again, a well-respected man around town. He held numerous public positions, mostly as an assessor, and was later in the real estate and insurance business. Was a member of many fraternal organizations, but not just a member. He was president of the Exempt Firemen's Association, president of the Masons, president of the Oddfellows, and the Pioneer Society, and of course, president of the Sacramento Spiritualist Union. They were established in 1879. In the historic city cemetery lies a forlorn plot near the Pioneer plot, which is the final resting place of several members of the Sacramento Spiritualist Union. And FELCH's name is on the deed granting the plot from the Pioneers to the Union. And he was elected president of the Pioneer Society the following year, so obviously those actions didn't upset anybody. LUCRETIA and A.B.C. NUSBAUM. They used to be buried near the Pioneer plot, but they were moved to the Oddfellows Cemetery around 1924. A.B.C. was known as Alphabet and was a fruit rancher producing blackberries among other crops. They were spiritualists and freethinkers who also hosted events in their place, such as literary society meetings and Christian Science lectures. Reports were published of Mrs. Nussbaum's strange and incoherent letters she sent to many people, public employees and private citizens alike. Calling herself the sovereign of the universe, she flooded several county boards and boards of supervisors with her odd letters, asking them to send her the money due to her from bonds being held by the county, which was zero, of course. And they're all a variation of this. You send me my bonds, no delay, Mrs. L.J. Nussbaum, supreme in God, amen, 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 so be God, amen, 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 amen. They were examined by physicians and declared to be sane in 1898. They were so well known for their odd behavior that in 1899, when a merchant brought a suit against them for ordering goods and then refusing them when delivered, the Union newspaper unsympathetically said the eccentricities of this couple have been so often referred to in the papers that it seems strange that anyone could be deceived by them. Erratic behavior and not paying their bills meant that judgments were rendered against them and they were declared incompetent so that they would not lose their property in their old age. At the hearing, Alphabet spoke quite rationally and displayed knowledge of recent ranch business and details of his crop's progress, yet claimed not to have received a summons he did receive or know anything about a judgment against him in court. In November 1899, Mrs. Nussbaum was sent to the Stockton Insane Asylum for treatment of her mental disorder. According to the paper, Spiritualism seems to be the cause of her mental affliction. Well, obviously it wasn't the cause of it. Trance speakers. Spiritualism made the delicate constitution and nervous excitability commonly attributed to femininity a virtue and lauded it as a qualification for religious leadership. Passivity, susceptibility, impressionability, these were all seen as positives for mediums. Thus, mediumship allowed women to discard limitations on women's role without directly questioning accepted ideas about women's nature. The trance speakers of the 1850s, Cora Hatch, who's pictured here, in 1857, and she's probably about 17 years old in this picture here. Also, Emily Beebe, Emma Harding, and others usually only spoke while in trance. The fact that young, uneducated women were able to stand up in public and eloquently and knowledgeably lecture on complex issues of philosophy, politics, and current events in itself evidenced spiritual agency to many folks, since few believed that a woman could do such a thing unaided. The independent woman in the guise of the trance speaker enthralled her male audience. They would have been the first, oh, here's Emma Harding. They would have been the first female speakers that most Californians had ever seen. It was quite a curiosity. In these 1850s, women pioneers were usually quite young, some as young as 16, and traveling by themselves in the Wild West. They usually stayed with spiritualist families, and it wasn't unusual for the head of the family to be smitten with a female lecturer. A spiritual admirer of Cora Hatch recalled that her entrancing eloquence made his heart throb with sacred emotion. Or something was throbbing. This is Emma Harding here, and Harding. Let's skip here. Emma Harding was well known as a trance speaker and visited California often. And this is ad for appearance for her in Sacramento. A sign of the respect that she had as a speaker is that she gave a funeral oration for Thomas Starr King, influential California orator and Unitarian minister. Whilst we in human sense may miss our loved one, we cannot murmur at his removal. We look not for him, therefore, in the voiceless tomb that only shrines a form and never held the spirit that has triumphed in arisen liberty from the dust that held it. But the following from the 1859 San Francisco Times is typical of the period. Free love, spiritualistic, and bully women seem to be all the rage in the eastern part of the states. Every woman who, like Cora Hatch, Mrs. Sickle, Mrs. Fry, and the like, can in the most speedy manner cast aside all that enables and refines their sex, and stride into the arena of man and become mixed up in all sorts of disgraceful brawls and pugnacious propensities, is sure to be patronized and encouraged by the crowd of spiritualists, socialists, etc. Oh, and here's a picture of a spirit photo of her with the spirit of Beethoven. Here's another picture of Emma Harding. During the Civil War period, non-spiritualist women's rights advocates abandoned agitation for women. After the war, the movement became more narrowly focused on gaining the vote for women and abandoned other issues like dress reform, marriage reform, and economic rights, but not the spiritualists. When female speakers were needed in California to speak in favor of suffrage in 1870, both to the legislature and the public, they enlisted the support of the only ones who had any experience, the trance speakers of the 1850s. Ironically, the spiritualists found themselves and their radical agendas being pushed out of an increasingly more conservative women's movement from the 1870s onwards. Here's another trance speaker who was an early suffrage speaker, Laura DeForest Gordon. Over the years, the spiritualists, being citizens of the modern age, and incorporated increases in technology to prove their point. By the 1870s, mediumship had evolved, and what was now popular were physical manifestations, cabinets, trumpets, spirit photos, and of course, full-size fantastic bodies, and later on, ectoplasm. Think of it as a switch from black and white to 3D in color. By the way, you can make your own ectoplasm in the safety of your own home. There's 2 simple recipes. When soap, gelatin, and egg whites are mixed together and blown into the air, they will shimmer and glow in forms that resemble bubbles. A less effective but simpler mix is toothpaste and peroxide, which will create a foaming substance which in really low light might resemble ectoplasm. Henry TREICHLER. Mr. and Mrs. Henry TREICHLER were longtime friends with James Marshall, the gold discoverer. And in 1884, the year before he died, he was made their guest in Sacramento. In 1992, the headlines read, Mrs. TREICHLER tells how the spirits dominated her husband. Mrs. Emma B. TREICHLER commenced suit in the Superior Court yesterday against her husband, Henry TREICHLER. Henry TREICHLER is the gentleman in the bottom left corner with the chin beard. Dr. W.W. Light was made a co-defendant in the suit, and that is Dr. Light with the gorgeous beard there. TREICHLER is the proprietor of the Mechanics Exchange, which, according to the union, a cheap hotel on I between Front and Second. Recently, Mrs. TREICHLER alleges he was converted to spiritualism by Dr. Light and some others, who then proceeded to conspire to get his property from him. It is said that they induced him to believe that the spirits had decreed that he should deed all of his property to Dr. Light, and that in obedience to this decree, TREICHLER did so. Mrs. TREICHLER now alleges that the whole thing was a plot to rob her and her husband, particularly herself. She sues for a divorce and for half of the community property after it is taken away from Light by the court. And the court said Light could have it. TREICHLER was a man, and a man could do what he wanted with his property. Sorry, ladies. TREICHLER died the year after his wife divorced him, and he left her all of his money to his children, nothing to her, but he did leave her an empty spot in the family plot next to him. So maybe they could continue this conversation. This is Dr. W.W. Light referred to previously, and these pictures are from, they might be kind of shiny because they're taken in the special room at the California room at the State Library. He was from Ohio and had been a doctor and a dentist. And he was in Mexico when he heard of the gold rush that started for California in January 1849. Stuck in the Isthmus of Panama for 2 months, he was put to work saving those with the fever. After a 102-day journey on an old whaling boat, they reached San Francisco. He mined for a while. He actually mined throughout his life. And then went to San Francisco, or Sacramento, and set up practice as a doctor just in time for the cholera epidemic of 1850. After that, he quit being a doctor and was just a dentist for the rest of his life. He was a surgeon during the Maximilian War in Mexico, and a Mexican soldier he had befriended directed him to a mine of fabulous richness. Unfortunately, it was also deep in hostile Yaqui Indian territory, and he and his brother and nephew, his brother and nephew were killed. He was wounded in hand-to-hand fighting and forced to abandon the mine and went back to Sacramento. He had been a sitting president of the Society of Pioneers when he died in 1895. Here's another picture of him. His niece Mary contested the will on allegations of incompetence because he didn't leave her any money. The judge said that he was eccentric and was not considerate of the feelings and sensibilities of others, but withal he was a man of good hard sense and could give his money or not give his money to whoever he pleased. And those are the haunted eyes of Dr. Light. I think by this time in his life, he's probably seen scores, if not hundreds of people die before his eyes in epidemics and wars. Within the belief system of spiritualism, as well in a broader Victorian context, seeing was believing. At least in the early days, no one questioned the sincerity and innocence of the young girls who became mediums. Later on, when trance speakers were replaced by mediums, it was hard to blame mischievous spirits when one was exposed in a sheet and wig inside a cabinet portraying a beloved child. Spiritualists were concerned with all social relations that placed one person in a position of authority over another. That would obviously include slavery and suffrage, but could go even deeper to the issues of marriage reform and health issues and control of their bodies, to regarding meat eating as an act of violence. Some took this idea to extremes. One of the spiritualists' less urgent reforms was anti-organization, which explains why it took them nearly 40 years to establish a national organization. In fact, during the National Women's Rights Convention of 1852, still dominated by radicals, they debated and defeated us. What organization in the world's history has not encumbered the unfettered actions of those who created it? Also, a loosely affiliated, it wasn't really until about 1893 when the National Organization of Spiritualists was established that they had a lasting national organization. The California Spiritualist Association of America was established shortly thereafter. So these are the 7 principles of spiritualism from History of Ghosts: the divine, eternal parenthood, the family of humankind, the interconnectedness of all creation, the communion of spirits and the ministry of angels, the continuous existence of the human soul. personal and social responsibility, including compensation and or retribution in the hereafter for the good and evil deeds done on earth, and eternal progress open to every human soul. This is a little later, I think probably in the 30s, but it's still pretty accurate. Most of the descriptions I've read, they didn't believe in a hell. They believed in people who'd done wrong would be given opportunities to make it good. Benjamin Todd was a Massachusetts lecturer on spiritualism and a Greenback Party congressional candidate. He went up and down the coast beginning in 1866. The Union reported Todd has been lecturing through the valley towns and spreading forth his doctrines with munificent offers of cash to any authorized clergyman who would debate with him. Somehow or other, the $100 per day always faded from his memory when the time for applying for it arrived. He debated a Christian reverend, and the paper had this to say: Todd went into a wholesale denunciation of the facts of Bible history and of the patriarchs and prophets, attempted to blackguard the scriptures, to pander to vitiated taste rather than deal an argument, and so disgusted many who expected better things. In addition to a general denial of the inspiration and truth of the old scriptures, he denied that Christ existed as laid down in the new. He had at command all the arguments of infidel philosophy and often made forcible use of them, though not always with good taste, unquote. Todd claimed, here's another ad for him, claimed that his guardian angel stood beside him, visible to his eye, in the form of a lady friend of long ago, and that she encouragingly and spiritually placed her shadowy hand upon him while he was speaking. I'm assuming on his shoulder, but maybe somewhere else. He made about $400 a month from his exhausting lecturing in the countryside, and used part of his profits to publish the spiritualist weekly paper Banner of Progress, which lasted a year or so, and I haven't been able to find any copies. It was a religious paper, but Todd summed up his view of his readers here. Nearly all spiritualists are radical reformers in the direction of women's suffrage, justice to the red man, and the rights of all men and women. In 1870, a Sacramento lecture was sparsely attended, as the Union was delighted to point out. It consisted of a fair proportion of women who seemed to attach a great deal of importance to the speaker's remarks. And he said, reported in the Union, every person has his or her God. They have him in their body. He is blended with their flesh, and he is of their own creation. How splendid that doctrine, a God for each person. The speaker would not share his God with anyone. Between him and his God there is peace. If he divided, a row would certainly ensue. He did not believe in that God said to be in heaven. Heaven is too far off. He wanted his God with him all the time without intermission to consult him. This doctrine, once firmly established, churches will disappear. Every man will be his own church. No more priests and ministers to dole out so much doctrine for so much a year. In 1880, he was nominated as Greenback Party candidate for Congress. He traveled all over the state, speaking to crowds of widely varying size and interest. Speaking of the Greenback Party, one contemporary observer noted that more than half of them believed that the spirit world inspired their movement. Mediums and trance speakers were influential Greenback orators, as were women. The Greenbackers' platform, as you might expect from a party of refugees from other parties and interest groups, was quite radical. Besides their obvious issue of paper money, it included treating the railroads as public utilities, land reform, equal rights, and other really long shots. Todd returned from the canvass of the district on October 21st, oops, go back here, and was taken sick and died within a week. It says brain fever, but it also says fatigue, so we don't really know what he died of. And that seems to be the impetus for the Sacramento Spiritualist plot in the cemetery in 1879. We mentioned his TODD spirit guides. Spirit guides were often Native Americans, as they were seen to be more in touch with nature, or famous people like Ben Franklin or Abraham Lincoln. Voice of Reason Tom Paine became a favorite spirit, and some spirit guides were family members or friends who had passed to the Summerland. Nope, not yet. First, I guess the slide's not working for this other one here. There is a poem that's apropos from a book called Poems of Free Thought. I want to be an infidel. I want to be an infidel, and with infidels to stand, no crown upon my forehead, nor harp within my hand. I'd rather be an infidel, the very book and creed that binds the soul in galling chains and fails to meet its need. I want to be an infidel, from superstition free, my God in heaven within the soul, my church and priest to be. I'd rather be an infidel and champion human rights than wear the garb of priest or king with all their lordly might. I'd rather be an infidel and my church within my mind than lend a hand to sect or clan, my brother man to bind. Pretty strong. Sounds like a pretty good punk rock song too. It's got a beat, you can kind of dance to it. Victoria Woodhull is a fairly famous example of an early suffragette that was a spiritualist. She was also a magnetic healer and advocate of free love, which meant the freedom to marry, divorce, and have children without social restriction or government interference. She was the first woman to run for president of the US in 1872 under the banner of the Equal Rights Party. Spoiler alert, she did not win. She's a fascinating character. We don't have time to get into her, but I recommend the book Other Powers if you want to discover more about her. This is a picture of the Executive Committee of the National Women's Suffrage Association, established in 1869. I wonder how many spiritualists are in this picture. Another famous Sacramento story, May Woolsey, buried in the Old City Cemetery. May Woolsey was a young 12-year-old girl who lived in Sacramento with her parents. I guess those pictures don't want to work. May liked to draw, wrote creepy poetry, and liked going to parties. Okay. Okay. So we'll just tell May's story without the pictures. May was a 12-year-old girl who developed encephalitis and died very suddenly in 1879. Her parents were heartbroken and consulted at least 2 mediums. We have a transcript of one of their spirit messages, and it's typical in the way it addresses the afterlife, saying there's no sorrow and the spirits are not idle but have a mission. May's heartbroken parents put her belongings in a trunk and put it under the stairs, which they walled off. Flash forward 100 years, and the new owner knocked down the wall and found the trunk full of May's stuff. The trunk itself resides at the History Museum in Old Sac, and a lot of the insides can be viewed at the Center for Sacramento History. So who were they? Who were they? Who were the spiritualists? African Americans did largely not identify themselves as spiritualists until the 20th century, although there are a few mediums floating around. Spiritualists would largely identify themselves as Christians, and mostly of the liberal Protestant background, but there were a few Jews and Catholics. And of course, there was the rationalist wing that rejected Christianity altogether. The spiritualists believed that people continue after their physical death and that they could talk to the spirits. With the belief that there was no final change at death, the underpinnings of Christian theology lost their explanatory function. You no longer needed original sin or predestination or infant damnation to explain the fate of the soul after death. With no threat of judgment or punishment, humanity needed no redemption and therefore no atonement. Christ himself became logically unnecessary, as did the Gospels that announced his resurrection. Spiritualism's denial of death offered a unique kind of consolation to the bereaved. They did not believe in hell, thinking it inconsistent with the benevolent God. Messages frequently focused on the spirit's happiness after death and continued concern for surviving family members. Spiritualists responded by wearing white instead of black for mourning wear and emphasizing the continuity of life, not the finality of death. The person was not gone, but translated or had entered the summerland. This may seem similar to what is said at most funerals, but the spiritualists complained that the Orthodox minister did not really believe the words of comfort they spoke at funerals. Spiritualists also embraced the rural cemetery movement, making the gloomy cemetery into a lovely garden with scenic views and seats designed for the contemplation of happy memories and heavenly reunions. Spiritualist cosmology reviewed nature as a benign reality that revealed the divine order, making themselves very attractive to transcendentalists and Walt Whitman popular with the spiritualists. Here's another, oh, I guess that slide won't work either, so I'll just read it. This is another one from that book, Poems of Free Thought. I once thought the Bible was God's holy word, that reason opposing should never be heard. I made it my study, my everyday care. Its falsehoods were truths, its curses were prayer. To doubt was a crime that could ne'er be forgiven, and faith was the lever that raised us to heaven. I once thought that death was a monster accursed, of evils the greatest, the last, and the worst. His maw, so insensate, swallowed our race, and left of their beauty and glory no trace. The grave was a shadowland, cheered by no spring, where sat on his ice throne a skeleton king. I once thought that earth was a valley of tears, a wilderness world full of sorrow and fears, that God's curse had blasted his beauty and grace and poisoned the fairest and best of the race. I wept as I thought of his horrible ban and sorrowed that God should have made me a man. Fond fables of childhood, my faith in you fled. You lie in the tomb with the dust-covered dead. Women had no right to refuse their husbands' sexual advances or to prevent the resulting pregnancies. Spiritualists complained rape is punished out of wedlock, but in it paid no attention to. In place of conventional marriages in which women relinquished their autonomy in exchange for economic support, spiritualists proposed an egalitarian bond based on mutual spiritual attraction. Some promoted the concept of spiritual affinities, arguing that the natural order contained one true mate for every individual, and that the union of true affinities lasted forever. Always the trailblazers, the spiritualists stood out from other groups by opposing enforced maternity earlier in the 19th century and insisting on a frank discussion of the issue. They occasionally risked jail to assert the need for a graphic discussion of sex and procreation. Oh, that slide doesn't want to work. You just have to use your imagination. Free love could more accurately be called freedom not to love. It didn't have anything to do with wife swapping or love that one you're with or any of that nonsense. Instead, it referred to the belief that the morality of sexual intercourse depended upon freely experienced, compelling mutual desire, that is, love, not on whether the parties were married. In fact, under that definition, even the sexual experiences of many married couples of the time were immoral. Free love meant the freedom of women to refuse their husband's sexual advances, a potentially powerful source of autonomy in an age without contraception and little notion of sexual satisfaction for women. But the phrase was greatly misunderstood, and still is, and often used out of context to scare off people who would otherwise agree with their philosophy. In 1874, a bill allowing women to be school trustees was attacked in the California legislature by Congressman Tinnen by calling it the entering wedge for women's rights with its twin sister, free love, medium seances, spiritualism, communism, and all other isms with which the human race is now being persecuted. Humbug. Dress reform. If you've ever worn a corset and then tried to sit down or bend, you'll know that dress reform for women was sorely needed. Women's clothing was restricted and not made for any kind of movement. Corsets were always pulled too tight. Many health problems became associated with them. Dress reformers fought to free women from cumbersome clothing that restrained their limbs and organs and made it difficult to move comfortably. Some wore the American costume, kind of like the bloomers, but most wore fashions of their times. Dress reformers viewed women's fashions as morally debasing because they distorted the female form in order to appeal to male sensuality. Typically, spiritualists continued to wear and advocate dress reform long after most reformers had abandoned it. And it wasn't really until 1885 with the popularization of the safety bicycle scene here that we see women's fashion begin to become more functional. Health. While opponents of women's rights argued that women's reproductive organs inclined them towards disease and debility, the spiritualists rejected this theory of medical original sin and held that women were naturally healthy, but that ill health resulted from artificial restrictions imposed by civilization on women's physical abilities. A lack of exercise, unhealthy diet, restrictive clothing, and repeated unwanted pregnancies all contributed to mid-19th century women's poor health. Spiritualists dispense advice much in line with modern recommendations for avoiding health hazards, cancer, heart disease, alcoholism. They advise vegetarianism, abstinence from alcohol, tobacco, tea, coffee, narcotics, and recommended fresh air and exercise, even gymnastics. Medical treatment of the time was big on heroic therapy, that is, large amounts of harsh purgatives, stimulants, and narcotics, bleeding, etc., designed to shock the body system into working. The medical mediums might prescribe medicines, but they avoided the harsh drugs used by orthodox doctors. Some examined patients in trance, dispensing remedies prescribed by spirit doctors. Others healed by the laying on of hands. Temperance, and I guess my slide is not going to work here. As most good progressives of the time, they were against booze and its negative effects on the population. So while they objected to the intolerance and sectarianism of the evangelical temperance movement, they unanimously supported its goal. But there were scandals in the 1870s that reduced their number, and many joined other reform groups. Florence Cook, seen here, was a medium who in about 1870 started materializing a spirit called Katie King. And both Florence and Katie became celebrities. There are about as many pictures of the spirit Katie out there as there are of Florence. Eventually, someone noticed the great resemblance between Katie and Florence, and the spiritualists responded, well, of course they look similar. Spirits borrow energy and even matter from the mediums as they were materialized. That explanation didn't satisfy everyone. And the debate over her honesty raged on for years in the spiritualist community. Henry Slade, seen here looking slick, was a famous American medium who is known for his slate writing. The slate, which is like a little portable chalkboard, would be clean, and at the end of the sitting would be filled with messages. While appearing in London, a young skeptic attended his sitting and grabbed the slate before the writing was to take place and found a message already there. The newspapers reported the incident and Slade was charged in court in 1876. He was convicted and sentenced to 3 months hard labor, but the sentence was overturned, and he immediately left the continent before another summons could be drafted. There were now more opportunities for women in organizations, so they weren't spiritualism wasn't the only game in town. It enjoyed a resurgence in the 1880s, but it never resumed its earlier role as a central agent of feminism. However, the women empowered by the movement went on to use the skills to speak out for controversial causes, even if the reform movement as a whole became uncomfortably stuffy and conservative, and eventually they had to align with the dreaded Calvinist killjoys to pass temperance legislation. And finally, in the fall of 1888, Maggie Fox, with her silent sister Kate by her side, appeared on stage at the New York Academy of Music and admitted publicly that it had all been a hoax. The women proceeded to demonstrate before the large, rather annoyed audience the unusual skill that had taken them all in. The girls who had begun the spiritualist craze had indeed done so by learning to crack their knees and toes at will. There was a large degree of disillusionment and fallout after the scandals of the 1870s and after the Fox sisters recanted their statements, and spiritualism numbers faltered, and it soon had several rivals for public attention. Theosophy was one of several mid-century religions that vied for adherence with spiritualism. Translations of Eastern works like the I Ching and the Bhagavad Gita became available in Europe and the US around that time and exposed many to Eastern philosophy. Theosophy accepted the existence of seance manifestations, but attributed them to astral projection and magical forces, not to spirits of the dead. They also believed in reincarnation, a concept not a part of most spiritualist belief at that time. The major difference was that while spiritualists believed in an egalitarian communication with the dead in general, Theosophists sought the secret wisdom of occult adepts. Occultism simply means hidden powers, and they believed that these secret masters had entree to secret knowledge that could give access to magical powers. Well-known California spiritualist William Emmett Coleman wrote that it amounted, here's her book, that it amounted to a mongrel mixture of Brahmanism, Buddhism, Christianity, Rosicrucianism, Kabbalism, European medieval magic, the Hermetic philosophy, Cartesian reincarnation, astrology, modern spiritualism, and a lifeless Levi's Parisian system of magic, with a little morsel of modern science and philosophy thrown in to give it a slight coloring in conformity to 19th century modes of thought. He continued, this hodgepodge of rubbish fabricated by Madame Blavatsky, the product of one old woman, has been and is being accepted by a number of other old women of both sexes, some of them being those who were formerly spiritualists. And here's Coleman here. Coleman, buried in the Old City Cemetery, was a medium, writer, and lecturer on occult subjects. He was born in Virginia, raised as a Methodist, was a good student. He left school at 11 when the teacher no longer had anything to teach him. From 11 to 16, he worked as assistant to the librarian in Richmond and was the first Republican there, pre-Civil War. He became a proponent of many progressive ideas of the time, like women's rights, abolition, marriage and divorce reform, prison reform, secularization of the state, all issues the spiritualists were active participants in. Coleman was a non-Christian spiritualist and wrote several antagonistic tracts like Why I Am Not a Christian Spiritualist and The Bible God Disproved by Nature. He was married. His wife was a fellow spiritualist and reformer. became known as an authority on subjects relating to the Orient, occultism, archaeology, theology, science, and mythology. Moved to San Francisco and was the early and vocal critic of theosophy, and claimed that it was just plagiarized. The theosophists tried to challenge his bona fides in the argument in an editorial of the spiritualist journal Light, questioning his membership in certain societies. He had apparently written a book-long expose of theosophy, which was never published and seems to have perished. But he did write an article, and looks like he lectured against Madame Blavatsky, who he accused of wholesale garbling, distortion, and literary forgery. To quote a 2013 article in the Sci Pioneer Journal, Blavatsky very clearly plagiarized, though her method of sometimes reading these works from the astral plane might be held to exempt her from the typical literary standards of her time. So I don't know, does it still count as plagiarism if you read something from the astral plane? At the 1897 convention of the California Spiritualists Association, Coleman rang the alarm over false mediums, mentioning a sucker list being passed among them. These lists, beside the names, give the names of the departed relatives of the same in such incidents as will convince the investigator that the manifestations are genuine and that they are really receiving messages from the dear departed. He started another group in 1898 called the Truth Seekers. And they said they declare the greatest grievance they have against the state board is they do nothing to suppress the frauds and fakers of the city who are doing a thriving business just at present in the slate, card, and dark seance specialties. And 1903 interview, he said he had drifted away from spiritualism because it is dominated by an army of fakers and imposters who have mixed a world of deceit and absurdity with the logical idea of immortality of the human spirit. He donated his 20,000 volume personal library to local libraries in San Francisco, and unfortunately most of them were destroyed in the fires following the earthquake of 1906. But he was afraid of being buried alive while in a state of coma, which was an occurrence much more common now than it is today. I mean, back then, much more common back then than it is today. He put it in his will that both the radial artery in both wrists should be opened to make sure that he was not buried alive. The Alameda health officer ordered the arteries cut, and in case you're curious, he really was dead. I guess that photo's not going to work either. How about that one? Here we go. Fraudulent mediums. There were, of course, frauds and con men among the mediums. And mediums like Coleman were concerned enough to start organizations to weed them out. The following comment is from the Record Union of 1977. The most pernicious imposition of the fraudulent mediums, however, and the one in which our opinion most loudly calls for repressive measures, is the manner in which they traffic upon the most sacred feelings of humanity and pretending to hold communications with departed spirits. This, in the great majority of cases, is deliberate and unadulterated fraud, and it deserves the execration and the severest condemnation of all right-thinking men and women. There is hanging upon spiritualism a brood of vampires who are neither honest, earnest, nor true, and who, being only clumsy conjurers, profess to be in league with supernatural powers. We do not attack spiritualism in attacking these swindlers, but if spiritualists are foolish enough to make the cause of the swindlers their own, they must abide the consequences. The most serious challenge to mediumship came in the new religious movement, Christian Science, founded in 1875, which accepted much of spiritualism's basic outlook, but rejected mediumship altogether. The most obvious difference between the two is that the spiritualist had no written dogma, no books, whereas Christian Science had one textbook written and controlled by one author, Mary Baker Eddy. Its text is very much a product of the times, full of references to animal magnetism, Father, Mother, God, Christ principles, and other terms with which her potential Victorian public would have been familiar. In fact, she herself had come from New England where spiritualism enjoyed wide acceptance and had been a follower of mental healer Phineas Pankhurst Quimby, great name, before the debilitating 1866 fall on the ice that led to the development of her new religion. Even though she politely rejected mediumship, ironically enough, she found her first sympathetic audience among those whose interest in unorthodox metaphysics drew them to spiritualism. While writing Science and Health, she lived in two different spiritualist boarding houses where politeness compelled her to take a seat at the seance table. At the third spiritualist home she stayed at while writing her book, she converted the hostess to Christian Science. She even advertised for students in the Banner of Light, the spiritualist newspaper. So Christian Science denied the reality of death, disease, and of evil. They thought people inherently good, embodying God within. They believed God is good, God is all. According to Eddy, God is the only reality, and whatever is not God is insubstantial and non-existent. Thus, evil does not exist, but only reflects our false belief in its existence. Christian Science practice rested on the belief that correct thoughts, which rejected the erroneous belief on the reality of evil, could change material conditions. Physical ailments could be cured by thoughts in harmony with the divine mind. But Eddy called spiritualists gross materialists because they based their beliefs on manifestations that showed the continuity of individual characteristics after death. Eddy would have said we never really had physical bodies to begin with, that the only part of the individual that ever really existed was the spirit, before or after death. As opposed to many critics' allegations of spiritualist fraud, Eddy gently explained the phenomenon without questioning the integrity of either the investigator or the medium. She said, there are undoubtedly noble purposes in the hearts of noble men and women who believe themselves mediums. Eddy argued that real spirit communication would not address the senses, as spiritualists claim, but would appear without matter. Now, we're almost done here, so I'm going to give you a little treat and tell you about one of our favorite characters buried in the Old City Cemetery, Amory Crocker. You should be familiar with her. She was the daughter of Edwin and Margaret Crocker. Margaret Crocker founded the Crocker Museum and was a great philanthropist. Edwin Crocker was a lawyer for the Central Pacific, and he died in 1870, I believe it was, and he left her $10 million when she was 10 years old. And Amy became one of the first Bohemian Society celebrities. She had a fascinating life. She went all over the world. She was married 5 times, each time to a younger man. She was in the harem for a while with the Japanese prince. And her autobiography is entitled, And I'd Do It Again. Amy had a thing for powerful men and had long been a seeker after adventure and enlightenment. She loved the East and picked up Buddhism and Hatha Yoga while there. This is around the turn of the century, way before that was trendy. And she also wrote a book of really bad poetry. Amy went to sea. She was kind of a spiritual flirt. I'm sure that she attended a few seances in her time, but she was all over the map. She went to see the hypnotist and mind reader, Washington Irving Bishop, who had made a reputation for himself and a great deal of money on the vaudeville stage. Amy describes him in her book. My first sight of the man sickened me. He was scarcely more than a dwarf, had a large cadaverous face that pitted with pockmarks and yellow as old parchment. When Bishop asked for volunteers from the audience, she responded, of course, and was soon amusing her friends with her silly behavior. Bishop had become the most fascinating creature in the world. She studied hypnotism with Bishop, and this resulted, quoting her, in an infatuation which was to go on for several weeks. I am not, I may say, very proud of it. In her book, she called him a swine. The use he made of his power and his knowledge of human psychology was cowardly and caddish. We will not go into that, other than to say that he managed, fantastically enough, to make himself irresistible to women. About 2 years later, Bishop died in unusual circumstances. He became faint and lapsed into a coma. There was no pulse or respiration. Eventually, a physician was called and pronounced him dead. The police were notified and an autopsy performed. At the coroner's inquest, his mother made a scene. She's pictured here. He had been pronounced dead on several occasions before. They hadn't asked her to do an autopsy, and if they had, she would have told them that her son had had a condition that would put him in the coma for several days with no vital signs, and always carried a note to that effect on his person. No note was found. Amy claimed he practiced reaching the state and pulling himself out of the trance state. Apparently, he failed in this instance and was still alive on the autopsy table while the top of his head was sawed off and his brain removed. The mother wrote a book and spent the next 30 years of her life trying to bring her boy's murderers to justice, to no avail. Another notable suitor of Amy was occult master Aleister Crowley, best known as the wickedest man in the world and channeler of the Book of the Law, the handbook of his magical religion, Thelema, which is, with its famous invocation, "Do what thou wilt shall be the whole of the law." The seeker Amy was briefly one of several students, and he dedicated a poem to them entitled "The Disciples." But she was less a disciple, more a spiritual flirt, and she soon moved her attention elsewhere. For 10 years, he would ask Amy to marry him in letters and in person. The notorious Crowley thought Amy to be a scarlet woman, representing Venus, the female sexual impulse, and the liberated woman, and of course fertility. She would assist him in his spiritual journey. He came up with incantations to put her under his spell. He claimed an experimental coupling with Amy, which she, of course, denied. He found her technique to be astonishing and said, "She has a will like the holy phallus itself." That's what he said. Anyway, all of these people that we've talked about are probably worthy of an hour in of themselves. Loretta Forrest Gordon, Victoria Woodhull, Amy Crocker, they're all fascinating. And that wraps up this presentation. Of course, spiritualism continues to this day, but our focus is on the 19th century. So I would like to thank all of you for your patience, and thanks very much. And we'll open up for questions if there are anybody that have them.
If you'd like to ask questions, you can either type a question into the Q&A box or the chat box, or you can raise your hand and you'll actually, you can speak your question directly to the spiritual medium, Eric Bradner.
Ooh, I'm out here somewhere.
Okay. All right. Not seeing any questions so far, just some ectoplasm.
They still out there?
They're still out there. Still
Okay,
got 40
great.
people and spooky spirits from beyond the grave. Don't want to ask questions.
All right. Well, there are several books out there, like I said, and the Sacramento Union is online, as the Sacramento Bee is if you have a library subscription. And there's a lot of stuff out there on the internet now, too.
Okay. Oh, it looks like we do have a couple questions.
Okay.
First of all, wasn't Crazy Mary a spiritualist? I'm not sure if I'm aware who Crazy Mary is.
Yeah, I had a lot of stories, and I cut Mary's out of there, but Mary McCormick Brown, who's also buried in the cemetery, if you've been to the Old City Cemetery, she has the fabulous mausoleum that is kind of in the middle of the cemetery, and a very imposing kind of Egyptian. And Mary McCormick was a fascinating character. She married well and had some property, but yes, she was a spiritualist, and but she was also kind of nutty and switched doctors and religions off. So I don't know how long spiritualism held with Crazy Mary.
Okay, a few more questions coming in. The next one is, do you know whether Amy Crocker lived in the Crocker Mansion?
I don't know for sure, but I would say that I think that they did, as far as I know.
Do you know what year she was born?
I think 1860, but I'm not sure.
Okay. In that case, it's probably okay. I guess we actually have a response from our fellow historian, Matty Parfit, who says that yes, Amy grew up in the Crocker Mansion.
Yeah.
All right. We've got some more questions here. We actually have a couple of hands up, and I will let them ask the question. First question is from Galaxy A20. You may speak your question, Galaxy A20. But they're trying to unmute them, and they aren't unmuting. So maybe they've muted themselves.
Is there any thing?
Okay, we got another one. Question here from Kathleen. Kathleen, okay, you're now live, but your mic is also muted. I can't unmute it.
Do you know sign language still?
Okay,
Only.
am I unmuted now?
Yes, you are.
Okay, great, thanks. Can we get a list of the books available? Is there a list available to search on those?
I'll post a list of books. Altered States is one that I haven't read yet, but I just got. It looks a little dry. Radical Spirits is a really good one. History of Ghost is another good one.
And I also wanted to know if there'd be a replay or archived version of this talk to view again, because I arrived a few minutes late, so I missed about the first 15 or 20 minutes.
Yeah, these will be archived. Bill, you want to take that?
Yeah, they'll be available. We posted it live on the West End Club page, so it'll be on Facebook Live, and there will be a video link on the Facebook page. And afterwards, I'll see if I can get the video downloaded, and it'll be posted to YouTube. And I'll post the link also on the West End Club page.
Great, thank you.
All right, thank you. We have another question. Hold on, from Caroline Weiler. Caroline, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here. I was kind of curious. I think I lost connection to it some way in between. What, did you guys talk about Jane Stanford?
No, we didn't.
Do you have any information on her? I actually spent some time while I work at Stanford Mansion, and we actually ran across sources about her. Did you run across her in your research at all?
No, I didn't, but you know, as a society person in that time period, I would be surprised if she hadn't attended a seance.
Interesting. Okay, thank you. I just was, I'm happy. I'm happy. It doesn't seem that I actually missed that much. So I'm pleased. Thank you.
Yeah. And you know, it was largely kind of a, you know, middle class and upper class thing, you know.
Right. Thank you very much. It was very informative. Thank you.
Considering Jane Stanford's affection for Leland Jr., it would be really surprising if she didn't at least dabble in that. Okay, we have some questions from the Q&A box. Let's see. This is for Eric. Are there certain symbols we should be looking for on the headstones at the cemetery?
No, I looked, because I have identified other people than the ones that I mentioned here that were spiritualists, and there's no markings that I can tell on the headstones that would distinguish them as spiritualists.
All right. Okay, just looking for other questions. Kathleen, I'm going to lower your hand, I think, unless you have another question. And we have a question. Does the city cemetery still have an extensive bookstore?
No, we've been moved out of that office that was in the on the grounds there, and currently waiting to figure out if that we do have a library, but it's all in storage. So I'm not sure with the COVID thing right now what libraries are open. You know, the places I usually go for research are the California room at the State Library, the Sacramento room at the Sacramento Public Library, and the Center for Sacramento History. And I'm not sure what their, you know, what their access is currently.
All right. And it sounds like that the Sacramento Public Library books can be requested online and picked up curbside. And I had one person who requested if you could post Amy Crocker's terrible poems, but it sounds like the book is available, or those they may be available to read directly.
It's called Moon something or another. Moon, Maddie, if you remember what that is, I can't remember, but it's like a little chapbook, and they're just they're all self-referential poems, and they're just terrible. We did a bad poetry tour at the cemetery a few years back, and I read some of the poems, and it still smells.
All right. Well, it looks like all of our questions have been answered. So thank you, Eric, very much for an informative and spiritually enlightening presentation. Thanks to everyone who attended and stuck around. We'll have more presentations coming up this fall. We will announce them on the West End Club Facebook page. So stay tuned. And good night, everyone. We're shutting down now, and the video will be posted as soon as I can. Thank you.